Tonight at 10, immigration, the economy and the NHS dominate a heated clash among campaigners on both sides of the referendum debate. They vigorously made their case on live television with just 2 weeks to go before the vote.
On the streets of London, because of the European judges, there are terrorists and murderers and very serious criminals that we cannot deport, because the European court is taking control over that kind of question. I think we should take that control back.
Amber Rudd.
But Scotland's First Minister suggested Mr Johnson had other priorities.
Boris Johnson is not interested in your job or your protection. He's only interested in David Cameron's job. Thank you.
And two former Prime Ministers, Sir John Major and Tony Blair, have voiced their concerns about the effect of a vote to leave the EU, saying it could break up the United Kingdom. We'll assess where today has left the referendum debate, also on tonight's programme. There will be no prosecution of any MI6 officers after the detention and alleged torture of an opponent of the former Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi. A fresh inquiry has found there was collusion between police officers in Northern Ireland and loyalist paramilitaries in the murder of 6 Catholics in 1994. I'm with her, says President Obama, as he endorses Hillary Clinton to succeed him at the White House.
What flavour ice in?
And what are the life chances for children born to lower-income families? A new report says opportunities are improving.
Here, a damning report into a hospital's A&E department where patients were kept waiting in ambulances. And a council attempts to overturn a ruling which lets a father escape a fine for taking his daughter on holiday in school term time.
A very good evening to you. Immigration, the economy and NHS funding dominated again tonight as politicians clashed in a live TV debate ahead of the EU referendum. For Vote Leave, Boris Johnson said Britain should take back control over immigration and could prosper as never before outside the European Union. But Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, who wants the UK to remain in the EU, said countries had to work together and accused Boris Johnson of being more interested in David Cameron's job. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, was watching the debate.
Hi, nice to see you. The Red Team, their biggest name bringing up the rear, ready for the ordeal. The other team arriving one by one, but with a single position to defend. And the audience, all dressed up, with a debate to go.
Six of the main campaigners from both sides of the EU referendum debate will go head-to-head.
Immigration, the obvious first subject.
Which decision, leave or remain, allows us to put in place the appropriate controls to ensure that we have immigration that only improves and adds to our country?
Now, I'm massively pro-immigration. I'm the descendant of Turks and very proud of it too. But there's got to be democratic consent for the scale of the flows that we're seeing.
Australia is a massive country with a small population. They choose because they have a controlled system. If we have a controlled system, we can choose.
And within minutes, Boris Johnson, the obvious political target for the other side.
I want to do what Boris once said he would do, make the case for immigration and the contribution it makes.
This is a complex problem. There isn't a silver bullet, and I know that that's what Boris and his team would like to have, but you need to look at the numbers, although I fear the only number that Boris is interested in is the one that says number 10.
Then a vicious spat over the disputed claim by Vote Leave. The EU membership costs £350 million a week.
It doesn't cost £350 million to be a member of the EU, and you know that's
Are you saying that
true,
that's
and you've emblazoned it across your bus.
It's a bit rich to hear the man who used to say we should be charged for using the NHS pretend that he's now the defender of the NHS. I am staggered that Boris Johnson is standing here tonight still defending this £350 million a week figure. It's a scandal that that's still emblazoned across the campaign bus because it's an absolute whopper.
Boris Johnson again drawing the most fire from the other side.
Boris, get that lie off your bus.
May I respond?
And what we're going to do is repaint that bus, and we're going to put a leprechaun on one end, a great big rainbow on one side, and a pot of gold at the end.
It is perfectly true and verifiable that there is, in fact, slightly more than £350 million a week that we do not control. That we do not control. Huge sums of it go to Brussels and never come back.
Then to the nub of it all. Would we be richer or poorer? What would the economy look like if we left?
The country votes in 14 days, and we have no idea whatsoever from the Leave campaign what would be happening.
We have a very good idea from the Remain campaign.
No, we have no idea what would be happening with our trade. You can't tell us whether you'd do a deal, whether you wouldn't do a deal. You've said you'd come out of the single market, but you haven't said what you'd replace it with.
Can we just stop this, as Nicola Sturgeon so rightly said, a miserable, negative, fear-based campaign? Because people will see through this. This is not about any of us here on the panel. This is not about the current government. This is your once-in-a-generation choice as to who you think should have control over the majority of the money which we spend.
Boris, you don't seem to care about the millions of jobs that will be at risk if we leave the EU. I think you only care about one job, and that's your next one.
I don't think that you care. I don't think that you care. Sorry.
Again and again, outers brought it onto immigration.
On the streets of our city, on the streets of London, because of the European judges, there are terrorists and murderers and very serious criminals that we cannot deport, because the European Court is taking control over that kind of question, and I think we should take that control back.
Again and again, the in trio took the fight to Mr Johnson.
Boris Johnson is not interested in your job. We must allow Boris Johnson. He's only interested in David Cameron's job.
Thank you.
Labour has still to produce a woman leader of the party, though maybe Angela Eagle will sort that out at some stage.
Boris, beware of the blonde bombshell.
There wasn't quite a six-person shouting match, but...
How can the public really trust what any of you are saying?
Think about whether it actually is going to make us stronger, safer and better off by being in it.
I ask you to think more about what we have gained. The longest uninterrupted period of peace in modern history. The world's biggest single market of 500 million people to sell our goods and services into.
There is a contrast between this side of the argument that is offering hope and that side of the argument that is offering nothing but fear about life outside. They say that we can't do it on our own. They say that we can't leave the EU. We say that we can.
This referendum is not a debating society event. Tonight's clashes, part of a brutal campaign that could change our country for good.
Well, Laura Koonsberg is outside the London studios where the debate took place tonight. Laura, it was heated and frank at times. What impact do you think tonight may have on the referendum debate?
Well, Clive, as is inevitable at these kinds of events, within the last couple of minutes, both sides in this big argument have claimed victory. In truth, I don't think there was a sort of slam dunk or a hands-down show for either of the two trios. The clashes were mainly on immigration and the economy, as you would expect. What I do think was notable was two things. Just how bad-tempered it was, really, throughout the 2 hours, actually on every subject and almost between every politician. Also notable was what seemed to be an entirely deliberate strategy from the Remain side to go after Boris Johnson again and again and essentially accuse him of putting his ambition before anything to do with this referendum, accusing him time and again, even his own Tory cabinet colleague Amber Rudd, saying basically he's only in this fight because he's after David Cameron's job. Now I think the performances by individual politicians, as when there are 6 of them, inevitably were probably pretty patchy. But I think overall this hasn't necessarily shifted the momentum of this campaign. But this was a big, important event, the first chance for many viewers to have a good look and a good listen to some of these arguments. Undoubtedly, some people will have been influenced by what they've seen and what they've heard. But in terms of changing the dynamics of this campaign, I'm not sure much has changed.
OK, Laura, thanks for that. Laura Koonsberg there. And two former Prime Ministers, Sir John Major and Tony Blair, have set aside their political differences to issue a stark warning about what they believe would happen if Britain leaves the EU. Speaking in Londonderry, they said Northern Ireland's stability could be threatened and the UK may be torn apart. But there was swift reaction from Northern Ireland's First Minister, Arlene Foster, who wants the UK to leave the EU. She called the intervention disgraceful. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, reports.
Two retirees on a morning stroll, except John Major and Tony Blair were in Northern Ireland on business, walking the famous Peace Bridge for a purpose. They'd agreed an identical warning. The European Union and the gains of a peace they'd both brokered could be lost, and the UK itself broken up for good. If they'd been ageing rock stars, they'd have called this a farewell tour. The school-age audience was too young to vote, too young for nostalgia. It sounded scary for the UK.
The unity of the United Kingdom itself is on the ballot paper in 2 weeks' time.
And for Northern Ireland.
Don't let them take risks with Northern Ireland's future. Don't let them undermine our United Kingdom.
Was he saying peace itself was at risk?
No one's saying the peace process is going to break apart the day after if you vote to leave. But one of the elements fundamental to that peace process, which is Republic of Ireland, UK both in the European Union, no border between North and South, that changes if we vote to leave.
A familiar scene at the height of the Troubles. But it's been peaceful for years, and Northern Ireland's leavers hit back at the idea that might change.
In my experience, the commitment of people in Northern Ireland to the political settlement and to exclusively peaceful and democratic means to determine Northern Ireland's future, I think that commitment is rock solid. And to say that it would somehow waver or become less resolute if there was a democratic vote to leave the EU, I think is not only unjustified, but actually pretty irresponsible.
I do find it rather disgraceful for two Prime Ministers who know full well the importance of the peace process here in Northern Ireland to come over here and suggest that a vote in a particular direction is going to undermine that is quite scandalous.
That wasn't all, though. Sir John Major was saying Scots might want out of the UK if the UK wanted out of the EU. Hadn't Downing Street said one referendum was enough?
If the country demanded that, it'd be politically impossible to refuse that demand by Scotland. You can't keep people in a country by force. If the demand was sufficient, one would have to concede a referendum.
Today's young audience, like so many others, was split.
I don't feel like any of the problems that they presented in there couldn't be dealt with by our community and by our generation. And I just think that the arguments they gave, they were trying to scare us.
I thought it was great. They made some really fair points about staying in the EU, and I think I would, if I could, vote to stay in the EU.
The campaign's grown intense. Here, as across the UK, it's about the economy, borders, migration, and the high stakes in play, and the fact it's impossible to call the outcome has made it brutal. The wounds being inflicted back and forth may be impossible to heal, but that's for the future. Just now, the voters in Northern Ireland and across the United Kingdom have a more immediate problem, deciding their and their country's future for decades to come. So two former Prime Ministers were here today, back in the front line of politics, to defend their legacy and try, once more, to persuade voters to share their vision of the country they'll leave behind. John Pienaar, BBC News.
No one from MI6 will face prosecution after the detention and alleged torture in 2004 of an opponent of the former Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi. Abdelhakim Belhaj is one of two men who claim the British intelligence service played a significant part in his rendition or transfer back to Libya to face interrogation. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera has more.
The man who says he was sent by Britain to Libya to be tortured, with his wife speaking for the first time on TV about what happened to her. They are angry at today's decision that no one will face criminal charges.
I'm very disappointed that individuals responsible will not be prosecuted. If there is political interference with the courts, then it undermines British justice.
Abdelhakim Belhaj is an Islamist who fought to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi's regime. When Tony Blair embraced Colonel Gaddafi in 2004 as relations were warming up, British spies were helping the Libyan leader get hold of his opponents. It was only when Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011 that details first publicly emerged, suggesting MI6 had worked with the CIA to send Belhaj and another man to Libya. Documents were found in Gaddafi's ransacked intelligence headquarters from Britain's MI6. Belhaj is referred to as a terrorist in letters allegedly written by Sir Mark Allen, then MI6's head of counter-terrorism. One document reminds the Libyans that the intelligence behind Belhaj's capture by the CIA was British, though it says the Americans paid for what's called the air cargo. That air cargo included Belhaj's wife, 6 months pregnant at the time and strapped onto a stretcher for the journey.
My hands and legs were tied and my eyes were covered. They injected me with something. I didn't know where I was going. I was 6 months pregnant. I was so scared that I was going to die.
She was released after 4 months, but her husband was held for 6 years and says he was tortured by the Libyans. The emergence of the documents led to a police investigation into MI6, which produced 28,000 pages of evidence. But today, the Crown Prosecution Service said witnesses could not recall sufficient detail, and it thought the evidence was not strong enough to secure a prosecution.
We don't understand how the CPS can say, on the one hand, British officials were definitely involved in rendition, and on the other hand, nobody is going to stand trial for it. The real question for all of us is MI6 subject to the law or are they above the law?
There will be relief inside MI6 that no former officers face prosecution. Those who've worked inside acknowledge that mistakes were made, though, in the early years of the war on terror. But critics will say that today's decision means no one will be held to account. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
President Obama has formally endorsed Hillary Clinton as his successor for the White House, saying he was fired up and couldn't wait to campaign for her. She became the Democratic Party's presumptive nominee this week, though her rival, Bernie Sanders, is continuing his campaign. In a video message, President Obama had this to say.
I know how hard this job can be. That's why I know Hillary will be so good at it. In fact, I don't think there's ever been someone so qualified to hold this office.
Well, our North America editor, John Sopel, is at the White House for us tonight. John, this clearly a moment for Hillary Clinton to savour.
Yeah, I think, Clive, she'll be savouring both the timing and the tone. The timing because this builds on the momentum that she achieved on Tuesday night when she held her victory party in Brooklyn, and the tone because actually Barack Obama could not have been more full-throated in his support for her, talking about her courage, her compassion and her heart to succeed, and also, as you said, saying, I'm raring to go, I can't wait to start campaigning with her, which he will do next week in Wisconsin. And in reply, Hillary Clinton has said, we have gone from being fierce competitors to true friends, which of course begs the question, what about the fierce competitor from this race, Bernie Sanders? Now he was here at the White House earlier on today. He stopped short of endorsing her, but he gave signs that he may well do in the coming days, and that will do a great deal for Democratic Party unity.
OK, John, thank you for that. John Sopel there at the White House. Now, the Northern Ireland Police Ombudsman has found there was collusion between the officers and loyalist paramilitaries in the murder of 6 Catholic men at a pub in County Down in 1994. A previous official inquiry into the Loughinisland killings found there was insufficient evidence of collusion, but it was quashed following a legal challenge by the victims' families. Our Ireland correspondent, Chris Buckler, has more.
The name of this quiet rural village will forever be linked to a notorious attack. Murders that have become known as a massacre. In June 1994, people had gathered at the Heights Bar in Loughinisland to watch a football match.
The Irish have taken over the Giant Stadium in New York.
The Republic of Ireland were playing Italy in the World Cup.
Everywhere you look, you see orange, white and green.
And people were focused on the game when gunmen entered the bar and fired shot after shot. 6 men who came here to be with friends died together. Ever since, there have been claims that members of the security forces colluded in the killings. And today the relatives of those murdered in Loughinisland had that confirmed in an official report. Among them, Adrian Rogan's family.
They colluded in the murder of my father. Nobody cared that he was dying on the bar floor. But I did. And today is his day.
Because the truth has come out.
Because the truth is out. And they can't hide.
5 years ago, another Ombudsman report into the killings here was published. However, its findings were dismissed by the families of some of those who died as a whitewash, and they were eventually quashed in court. This new Ombudsman report says that police informants were involved in importing the guns used, that the killers were suspects in other murders and could have been brought to justice before the Loughinisland attack. And it says much of the investigation was characterised by incompetence, indifference and neglect.
The Ombudsman has stated that collusion was a feature of these murders, in that there were both willful and passive acts carried out by police officers. That's entirely unacceptable to me. That is an anathema to my standards.
The police have apologised to the families of the 6 men killed here in Loughinisland, as well as the 5 people who survived the shooting. But all of them know the passing of time has made it unlikely that anyone will ever be held accountable for the mass murder committed in this village. Chris Buckler, BBC News, Loughinisland.
A major report into mistakes made in maternity units across the UK has found significant failings. An inquiry by the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists discovered that more than 900 incidents which led to deaths or severe brain injuries were reported last year. A quarter of the hospital investigations carried out following an incident were inadequate, and in nearly 3/4 of cases, parents had no meaningful involvement in those investigations. Well, health ministers say they're committed to improving care. Here's Michael Buchanan.
Hey. Sorry, I can't stop looking at him.
The joy of new life. Natalie's already enchanted by Toby,
Lovely boy.
born just 5 hours ago.
It's been a lovely experience and the team have all been nice. Everybody from theatre to midwifery on here, so I can't argue. Can't argue with the treatment I've had at all.
Here at the Broomfield Hospital in Essex, staff pride themselves on ensuring that having a baby is a life-enhancing experience. A mistake in a maternity unit can be deadly. This is Louis Buckley. His short life lasted just 34 minutes. This is Lola, the sister he never met. And this is Michelle, the mother he never knew, happily pregnant once more. She fought to understand just why her son died in 2011. Though an internal investigation found multiple care failings, it took her local hospital 4.5 years to accept they'd caused Louis' death.
You've lost your child, that's the hardest thing, but then to have to fight for answers as to why they died. Through the 4.5 years, I relived his death every day. As soon as they admitted they were responsible for his death, it felt like my head had cleared. And I could just think of my son rather than all the mistakes that had happened that led to his death.
Too often, NHS maternity care isn't good enough, says this report. Stillbirths are more likely here than in many European countries. When mistakes do occur, the quality of investigations is often not good enough.
I genuinely thought that we would see more robust reviews, internal scrutiny, external professional involvement than we have done. I'm surprised at the lack of uniformity.
Michelle had to sue her local hospital to get them to accept responsibility for her son's death. The NHS compounding needless agony, failing to understand grief.
There's just a sadness. There's always a sadness there that you can't, it never goes. Everything's tainted with his death. And you have to live with that and learn how to relive again.
A happy parent with a healthy baby. The NHS needs to work much harder to ensure it happens more often. Michael Buchanan, BBC News.
The educational gap between rich and poor children in Britain is narrowing. A report from the Social Mobility Commission says whether it's helping with homework or reading bedtime stories, parents in poorer families are doing more than they used to. Our home editor Mark Easton has this exclusive report.
I'd like some icing and some strawberries, please.
What chance do these children have of fulfilling their potential?
Can I have an ice cream, please? We don't sell ice creams.
They live in one of Sheffield's most deprived neighbourhoods, a city with some of the widest inequalities in Britain.
Yeah, and let's put it on top, right? Yeah.
Across the UK, children from the poorest fifth of households are already a year behind the richest fifth by the age of 5. But ambition is undimmed.
Look what I can do!
Now, what about you, Sophia? What are you going to be when you grow up?
A hairdresser and a mermaid.
A hairdresser and a mermaid.
Sunshine! Sunshine!
But is the gap between the prospects for rich and poor children getting wider or narrower? The Social Mobility Commission, which advises government, has been looking at a rather gloomy prognosis from America and wondering, is it the same story here? World-renowned social scientist Robert Putnam recently offered an alarming assessment of social mobility in the United States, warning the American dream is in crisis.
Kids who are coming from well-off backgrounds are doing better and better. They're doing better in school, they're more likely to take part in extracurricular activities, they have higher test scores, whereas kids coming from lower, less educated homes are doing worse and worse.
So the Social Mobility Commission applied Professor Putnam's methods to Britain, and on key measures the results were a surprise. Parents helping their children with homework. Among graduate parents, the proportion has fallen slightly in recent years. Among parents with low qualifications, it's risen dramatically. Turning up at parents' evenings, a similar story. Again, the gap has narrowed. There is another measure of parental support the researchers call Gruffalo time. Now, the Gruffalo will be very familiar to most British parents, and it's become almost shorthand for adults reading with, talking with, and playing with their children.
Stacey, you do that one.
Back in the 70s, children could expect 23 minutes a day of this kind of attention. Now it's an average 80 minutes.
Surprise!
Surprise! Families and schools together.
Parenting support is no longer seen as something only for problem families. In fact, schemes like Families and Schools Together, run in hundreds of schools by Save the Children, are often oversubscribed.
Spending the time with Aaron and Sophia, and we've just doing a bit of craft and things sometimes that we don't always get the time to do it.
Forces you to do it?
Forcing me to do it, which is a little bit out of my comfort zone at times.
Stronger parental support is thought to lie behind big recent falls in truancy, underage drinking and smoking, and crucially, a narrowing of the gap in the experience of rich and poor. Mark Easton, BBC News, Sheffield.
Now back to our main story tonight, and the EU referendum. With it being just 2 weeks away, some of you may still be undecided which way to vote and need a little more information. Well, maybe the BBC's editors can help, and they've been answering some of your questions.
Mark Wallace asks about trade barriers. Now, if Britain were to leave the European Union and the single market, it is likely our goods exported to the EU would face some form of trade barriers. That's a tax on goods. That would have to be agreed by the other European Union governments. Britain, of course, could reciprocate. We could have trade barriers against European Union imports into Britain. Most economic models suggest that if you have trade barriers, that can be damaging to economies. For those economists who support Brexit, they say that actually freed from what they describe as the shackles of the European Union, we would be able to have free trade deals, no tariff deals, with big important economies like America and China, and that would be good for the British economy.
Roz from Brentwood wants to know what happens if hardly anybody votes. Well, there is no minimum threshold for turnout, so however many people go to the polls, the result will stand. Around here, most people expect turnout will be about the same as a general election, 60% or so. But the result is also expected to be tight. So how much enthusiasm both sides can muster to get their supporters to the ballot box could make all the difference.
R. Waddington asks why we can't stop EU criminals coming into Britain, and will we be able to deport them once we leave the EU? Well, free movement means we can't turn away everybody who's got any kind of criminal record from anywhere in the EU, but free movement is not an unqualified right, and if someone presents a serious threat to public security, we can and we do turn people away. As for deporting people, well, we do. 6,500 people have been deported under the European arrest warrant, but the courts do get involved. The European Court of Justice, which upholds EU law, and the European Court of Human Rights.
Liz asked what effect Brexit would have on the EU. Well, it would be a huge blow to an EU already weakened by the migrant crisis, the euro crisis and security fears following the Brussels and Paris attacks. Some EU governments fear if the UK goes, they'll come under pressure from their voters who want to leave the EU too. So you have countries like France now sounding tough, saying, of course, a post-Brexit UK would be an interesting partner for trade, but it shouldn't expect an easy or a generous deal. It doesn't want to make EU exit seem inviting. In the end, a UK outside the EU probably would get a good trade deal, but no one here wants to hand it to Britain on a plate.
Roy Bunyan wants to know, if we left the EU, would we get rid of all that EU red tape? Even the Treasury admits that complying with EU regulations can cost companies billions of pounds a year. So if we left, we could lose some of it, but not all red tape is cooked up in Brussels. Some of it is generated right here in Whitehall. And remember, one person's red tape is another person's consumer protection or employee safeguards. So some of it we might want to keep. As for exporting to Europe, if you want your products and services to go there, you have to play by their rules. So no escape from the red tape there.
And you can find special coverage of what our editors have been saying throughout the day on bbc.co.uk/news. And that's it here on BBC One. It's time for all the news where you are. Have a very good night.